Why would God allow a faithful man to reach his 40s and still lie down at night alone listening to the quiet hum of an empty room? Why would a man who has prayed, worked honestly, kept his integrity and trusted God through decades of waiting, still wake up to a pillow that holds no other breath but his own? That question has echoed through more hearts than people admit, especially in the still hours when faith is tested not by crisis but by silence. And yet here is the truth that shifts everything. Singleness after 40 is not abandonment. It is not evidence that heaven has overlooked you or that you somehow missed your chance. It can be divine timing and, more importantly, divine shaping. You did not stumble onto this message by accident. You're here because this moment is meant to interrupt despair and replace it with perspective, to lift your eyes from what seems missing and show you what is being formed. This is not a consolation message, it is a recalibration. Before we go any further, pause for a second and let your heart lean in. If this resonates, press like as an act of agreement. Share this with someone who quietly needs hope and type in the comments, "I trust in his plan." Those words are not empty. They are a declaration that you are still standing still, believing, still open to what God is doing beneath the surface of your life. In the quiet hills near Bethsaida there lived a man named Elias, and though his story sounds distant in time, it mirrors the inner life of many men watching this now. Elias was in his mid-40s, a faithful man whose days were shaped by honest labour and whose nights were shaped by silence. His hands were strong from years of working land passed down through generations, and his faith was steady, unremarkable in the way that true devotion often is, not loud, not performative, but constant. Each evening he would close the door of his stone house, and the stillness inside would greet him like an old companion, familiar, heavy, and uninvited. His bed was wide cold, untouched by another presence, and as moonlight spilled across the floor it illuminated not just the room, but the questions he rarely spoke aloud. He had done things right, he had waited, he had trusted, and still he slept alone. The villagers noticed, of course, they always do. Some called him reclusive, others whispered that something must be wrong with him, because in their minds a man alone past a certain age must be flawed, cursed, or difficult. But the truth was deeper, and it began years earlier with a wound that quietly reshaped everything. Elias had once been engaged to Leah, a woman admired by the whole village, graceful, intelligent, and the daughter of a prosperous merchant. Their future had seemed clear. The wedding had been planned. The dowry had been gathered through years of labour and sacrifice. Elias had allowed himself to hope to imagine coming home to warmth instead of silence. And then, without warning, Leah vanished. She ran away with a travelling trader, leaving behind not just broken promises, but a hollowed-out place in Elias's chest where trust had once lived. The betrayal cut deep, not only because she left, but because she took with her the years Elias had invested in believing that this was God's answer. His brother had tried to warn him, saying that beauty does not always signal loyalty, but warnings sound different after the damage is done. That night marked a turning point. Elias did not grow bitter, but he grew guarded. When his family later brought him potential matches, good women, kind women, women who would have gladly shared his life, he refused them all with the same quiet certainty. "She's not the one," he would say, even when he could not fully explain how he knew. Over time, loneliness stopped feeling like a season and started feeling like a permanent condition. Friends married, children were born, life moved forward around him while he remained still faithful and alone. Then one morning, as Elias worked his fields, something unexpected disrupted the rhythm he'd grown used to. Near the community well, he found a young woman collapsed from exhaustion and fear. Her name was Rachel, a woman nearly 15 years younger than him, wounded not just in body but in spirit, fleeing after raiders had attacked the caravan she travelled with. Elias did not hesitate. He brought her into his home, tended her injuries, shared his food, and offered her safety without expectation. And as the days passed, something in him softened that he had not realized was still capable of movement. Rachel was different. She was wise, gentle, and deeply rooted in faith. Her prayers were quiet but confident. Her presence did not demand anything from Elias, yet it awakened something long dormant in his heart. The house that had known only silence now held conversation again, shared meals and moments of peace that felt unfamiliar yet deeply right. For the first time in over a decade, Elias allowed himself to feel hope, cautious and trembling but real. And then came the second heartbreak, quieter than the first but just as sharp. One evening, Rachel sat across from him and spoke words that unraveled the fragile future Elias had begun to imagine. She told him the truth she had been carrying, that she was not truly a widow, that her husband still lived, that he had cast her aside because she could not give him children, and that according to the law she was still bound to him. Elias listened without interruption, but inside something collapsed. Once again, love seemed to pass through his life without staying. The next morning, Rachel left before dawn, leaving behind only a single sentence written carefully, almost tenderly. God's plans rarely make sense at first, but they are always good. That line became a seed planted in soil Elias did not yet understand. That night he wept in a way he had not since Leah left, but something was different this time. The pain did not turn him inward in bitterness. Instead, it opened a new question. For the first time, Elias did not ask, "Why is this happening to me?" He asked, "What is this for?" That shift marked the true beginning of his transformation. Months passed, seasons changed. The ache did not disappear, but it matured. Elias prayed differently now, less demanding, more attentive. He listened more than he spoke, and in that listening something subtle but powerful began to form. One afternoon, a group of children arrived in the village, barefoot, frightened, and thin survivors of a deadly illness that had swept through a neighboring region and left them without parents. Without hesitation, Elias opened his door. What had once been a house defined by absence became a place of refuge. Laughter replaced silence. Small footsteps filled hallways that had echoed for years. The love Elias had reserved for one woman poured into many young lives who needed a father more than he had ever needed a wife. And as time went on, the villagers stopped calling him lonely. They called him Father. It was only later, watching those children sleep safely by the fire, that Elias understood the design he could not see before. Had his life followed the path he wanted when he wanted it, his heart and home might have been too full to receive this calling. The solitude he once believed was punishment had been preparation. God had not preserved him to deprive him, but to position him. And that realization reframed everything, not just his story, but the meaning of every quiet night that came before it. What Elias did not realize at first was that the delay he resented was quietly shaping capacities he could not have developed any other way, because waiting is never empty time. In God's economy, it is training disguised as stillness, and as the months passed after Rachel's departure, Elias entered a season that looked uneventful from the outside but was profoundly active within. His prayers changed, first no longer rushed lists of requests or weary questions aimed at heaven, but slower, deeper conversations marked by listening, more than speaking, learning restraint instead of demanding relief, discovering that spiritual maturity often grows not when answers arrive, but when even silence teaches endurance. He learned how to sit with unresolved longing without letting it harden his heart, how to wake each morning and work faithfully without the promise of immediate reward, how to trust that obedience without clarity is still obedience. And in that quiet discipline, his inner life expanded in ways marriage alone could never have produced. This hidden formation reached its turning point not through a dramatic revelation, but through a human need that arrived at his doorstep when a devastating illness swept through a neighboring region, leaving behind children without parents, futures fractured before they had time to form, and when these orphans appeared in Beth Zur, frightened and unwanted. Elias recognized something before he could fully articulate it, that his home had been kept empty not by neglect but by design. The silence that once echoed through his halls suddenly became sanctuary. The wide bed that once symbolized absence now symbolized availability. And the house that felt unfinished was revealed as provision waiting for the right occupants. Laughter replaced loneliness, responsibility replaced rumination, and love multiplied beyond the narrow shape Elias once believed it had to take, because love formed through delay stretches wider, deeper and stronger than love rushed into prematurely. It was in this transformation that the revelation finally settled in his spirit with clarity and peace. That if he had built the life he wanted too early, he might not have had room for the assignment God prepared, because timing in God's hands is not about denial, but about alignment. Not about withholding joy, but about positioning purpose, and the waiting that once felt like loss revealed itself as preservation. This is where the story of Elias stops being ancient narrative and becomes a living mirror for men who find themselves single after 40, carrying a quiet ache that culture mislabels as failure because the lie most men absorb without question is simple and corrosive. That if you are still alone at this stage, you must not be enough, when the truth revealed through both scripture and experience is far more unsettling and far more hopeful that you may be alone, because God is preparing something deeper than what you have imagined. The biblical witness does not treat singleness as a deficiency to be corrected, but as a condition that when aligned with calling becomes a strategic advantage. And nowhere is this clearer than in the teachings of Apostle Paul, who spoke plainly in his letters that the unmarried man is able to focus on the things of the Lord with undivided attention, not as a moral superiority but as a functional reality. Paul did not frame singleness as a waiting room for real life to begin, but as a gift with its own responsibilities and powers, a season where clarity sharpens, distraction diminishes, and purpose becomes less fragmented, because a man unburdened by competing demands can respond more quickly and more completely when God calls him to move. This same pattern appears again and again throughout Scripture, dismantling the assumption that marriage is the ultimate proof of divine favor, as seen in the life of Jeremiah, who was explicitly instructed not to marry or have children, not because he was rejected, but because the weight of his mission required singular devotion, emotional resilience and freedom from attachments that would have fractured his obedience. His singleness was not an absence of blessing, but an intensification of responsibility, a sign that God trusted him with a calling that could not be diluted. The same thread runs through the life of John the Baptist, whose wilderness devotion shaped a clarity so sharp that he recognized truth before others could even see it, living apart from conventional stability, not because he lacked opportunity, but because intimacy with God demanded separation from noise, and his singleness was the soil in which discernment grew, enabling him to fulfill a role no married, settled life could have accommodated. And above all, the pattern reaches its fullest expression in Jesus Christ, who walked the earth as a single man, not out of limitation but out of necessity, because the scope of his assignment required undivided purpose, total availability, and freedom from personal claim that would have constrained his mission to love, serve, and ultimately give his life for humanity. If the Saviour himself lived unmarried to fulfill divine purpose, then singleness cannot logically be equated with lack, delay, or failure, but must be understood as one of the most misunderstood forms of consecration. When these lives are placed side by side with Elias, a coherent pattern emerges, one that reframes singleness after 40 not as punishment but as preparation, not as God saying no, but as God saying not yet, not like this. Not because you're insufficient, but because what is coming requires space you do not yet see. Singleness in this light becomes a forge rather than a void, shaping men who learn patience without passivity, strength without hardness, devotion without audience, and clarity without constant affirmation. It teaches a man to stand alone without becoming isolated, to listen deeply, without becoming withdrawn, to serve broadly without seeking validation. And these qualities do not develop easily in crowded seasons of life where identity is constantly reinforced by roles and expectations. In solitude, identity must be forged internally anchored in God, rather than reflected back through relationship status. And that anchoring is precisely what prepares a man to carry responsibility without being consumed by it. The delay that once felt humiliating becomes meaningful when viewed through this frame, because what feels like being passed over may actually be being set apart, and what feels like silence may actually be instruction in a language only the patient learn to hear. Elias did not become a father by accident, and Paul did not shape the early church by chance. And Jeremiah did not carry the burden of prophecy because he was overlooked, and John did not prepare the way because he lacked options, and Jesus did not walk alone because he was unloved. They walked their paths because the assignment required it. When singleness is consecration rather than punishment, the question shifts permanently from what is wrong with me to what is God building in me that requires this season, and that shift changes how a man prays, how he waits, how he serves, and how he views his own worth. For the man watching who's done everything right and still finds himself alone, this is the truth meant to interrupt despair that delay is not evidence of divine neglect, but often proof of divine intention that God does not waste seasons, especially the quiet ones, and that singleness after 40 may be the very condition that allows you to become the kind of man capable of carrying influence, responsibility, and love in forms far greater than the narrow dream you once held. When the house feels empty, it may be because it has been preserved when the bed feels cold. It may be because your heart is being kept available. And when the nights feel long, it may be because you're being trained to listen in ways others never learn. Singleness can be consecration, not punishment, and delay can be destiny in disguise, shaping men who are not behind but being built, not forgotten, but being formed, not lacking, but being prepared for something that will make sense only in hindsight, just as it did for Elias, when silence turned into sanctuary and waiting revealed its purpose. What this story asks us to do next is bring ancient wisdom out of the hills of Bethsur and set it down squarely in modern life, because the pattern God used with Elias did not end with him, and it did not belong only to prophets and apostles. It continues quietly in apartments, small houses, and bedrooms where men, over 40, stare at ceilings, wondering if time has passed them by. And this is where the reframe becomes not only spiritual but practical, because singleness in midlife is not merely a theological concept, it is a lived reality that shapes how a man thinks, reacts, loves, and leads. When wisdom meets real life, we begin to see that prolonged singleness can cultivate maturity that rushed partnership often cannot. Emotional regulation forged through solitude rather than crisis clarity born from having to examine one's motives without the mirror of a partner's approval and a depth of self-knowledge that makes future relationships, if they come, far healthier and less desperate. Men who walk long seasons alone learn how to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it, how to name emotions without being ruled by them, how to respond rather than react. And these are not small skills. They are the architecture of stable leadership, whether in a family, a church, or a community. Singleness, when embraced rather than resented, becomes a workshop where God teaches a man to master himself before he is asked to shepherd others, and that mastery does not harden him, it steadies him. As this internal strength develops, purpose begins to stretch beyond romance, because a man who is no longer defining his worth by who shares his bed starts to ask broader questions about who shares his influence, his time, his resources, and his wisdom. Service becomes more natural because availability increases, generosity expands because finances are not bound to a single household narrative, and leadership emerges because people instinctively gravitate toward men who are not scrambling to fill personal voids. Community building, mentoring, teaching, and quiet acts of faithfulness start to take shape not as consolation prizes, but as genuine callings. And this is where many modern men unknowingly step into the same territory Elias did, discovering that legacy is not limited to biology, but can be spiritual, relational, and generational in ways that outlive bloodlines. There are men today who never married, and yet have raised dozens through mentorship, who have steadied young men, drifting without the fathers who have opened their homes for prayer council and refuge, whose names may never appear on family trees but are etched deeply into the lives of people who would not be alive, sober, faithful, or whole without them. Consider the modern Elias, a man in his mid-40s who once believed he had failed some invisible test because he was still single, whose evenings were marked by quiet and whose prayers carried the weight of unanswered longing, until slowly, almost accidentally, his availability became someone else's lifeline. Perhaps it began with mentoring one teenager who needed guidance, which turned into hosting small gatherings, which grew into community outreach, which eventually shaped a ministry that touched hundreds. Years later, this man looks back and realizes that had his life followed the timeline he demanded at 30, none of this would have been possible, because marriage would not have been wrong, but it would have been different, and different would have limited the particular impact God had in mind. His legacy became spiritual rather than biological, not lesser, not incomplete, but expansive, and he discovered that fulfillment arrived not through the absence of desire, but through alignment with purpose. This is not an exception story meant to comfort the unlucky. It is a pattern that repeats whenever men stop measuring life by cultural milestones and start discerning divine intention. And this brings us to the most intimate reframe of all, the one that meets a man where his doubt is loudest, the bedroom scene that returns night after night, where the bed feels too large and the silence too sharp. And this is where God often asks the deepest question, not whether you are alone, but how you interpret that aloneness. When reframed through purpose, the empty bed stops being a scoreboard of failure and becomes an altar of consecration. A place where distractions are stripped away and identity is refined, where a man lays down not just his body but his expectations and says, even if I do not understand the timing, I will trust the hands that hold it. An altar is not comfortable, but it is sacred, and what is laid there is never wasted, and in that space God does not shame the longing. He repurposes it, teaching a man how to carry desire without being controlled by it, how to offer it back as fuel rather than letting it become resentment. This is where response matters, because understanding without engagement fades and faith without movement stalls. So the invitation is not passive reflection, but active alignment. Telling your story, even briefly, becomes an act of faith, not because the internet needs your words, but because your spirit needs to speak truth instead of silently absorbing lies. Naming your city creates connection, reminding you that you are not isolated in this experience, that there are other men nearby, walking similar roads, and that prayer is not abstract but local, specific, embodied. Sharing this message becomes a way of extending what you are receiving, because there is always another man quietly struggling, convinced he is the only one, and obedience often begins with the simple act of saying, if this helped me, maybe it will help him. And then comes the prayer moment. Not as a performance, but as a covering, speaking over you what heaven has not withdrawn, even when answers felt delayed, that you are seen when nights are long chosen, even when paths are unclear, and loved without condition or expiration date. As the story closes, the identity statement must land clearly and without hesitation. Because clarity ends confusion. Your singleness is not your weakness. It can be your training ground and your superpower, the place where God develops depth instead of haste, wisdom instead of noise, and resilience instead of dependency. God is not late. He is precise, and precision often feels slow when viewed from the ground, but reveals perfect timing when seen from above. Nothing in your story has been wasted. Not the years, not the waiting, not the unanswered prayers, because delay in God's hands is never empty, it is exact. And the next step is not to dwell endlessly on what has been said, but to keep moving, to stay in momentum, to continue listening, growing and aligning, which is why there is another message waiting for you, another layer of guidance meant to build on what has been awakened here. Do not let the flame dim by returning immediately to old narratives. Keep walking, keep trusting, Keep allowing God to redefine what a full life looks like, because your best season is not behind you. It is being prepared with intention, and when it arrives, you will not step into it half-formed, but whole-grounded and ready. As we bring this message to a close, let this truth settle deeply and permanently in your identity. Your singleness is not your weakness. It is not a flaw to be explained away, and it is not a delay that disqualifies you from a meaningful life. It can be your training ground and your superpower, the place where God has been shaping strength beneath the surface, sharpening discernment and building a kind of inner stability that cannot be rushed. What the world often labels as missing may actually be reserved, set apart so that your focus, your time and your heart can be formed without compromise. You have not been standing still, you have been standing firm. Every quiet night, every unanswered prayer, every moment you chose integrity over bitterness has been adding weight to your character, not subtracting value from your life. You're not incomplete, you're being prepared to carry something with depth, wisdom and authority that only comes through seasons like this. And hear this clearly, because doubt loves to twist timing into accusation. God is not late. God is precise. Precision does not always feel kind in the moment, but it is always intentional. What feels slow to you is often exact from heaven's perspective. God does not rush formation, because what he builds is meant to last. If he has allowed this season to continue, it is not because he has forgotten you, but because he knows exactly what this season is producing in you. He is not withholding good from you. He is aligning you with the right good at the right time in the right way. Nothing in your life has drifted outside his awareness. No birthday passed unnoticed, no prayer evaporated into silence, no tear fell without meaning. The same God who shapes history also shapes individuals, and he does not work on deadlines driven by fear, comparison, or cultural pressure. He works with purpose. So as you move forward from here, do not shrink back into old narratives that measure your worth by relationship status or timelines that were never authored by God. Walk with your head lifted, not in pride, but in peace. Let your life be proof that waiting can be powerful, that solitude can be sacred, and that obedience in quiet places still echoes loudly in eternity. And if this message has opened something in you, do not stop here. Momentum matters. Growth compounds when it is fed. There is another message waiting for you on this channel, one designed to build on what you have just received and help you keep moving with clarity instead of confusion. Click into it, stay engaged, and keep allowing God to speak into this season. Your story is still unfolding, and what comes next will make sense of what came before. Stay faithful, stay open, and stay expectant, because the God who has been precise with your preparation will be just as precise with what he releases next.